Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about George Romero's classic horror film, The Night of the Living Dead from 1968. So this is probably the first movie that really made zombies part of the American horror consciousness. There had been zombie movies before this, but this is the one that really sort of rocketed them into the stratosphere. So all of the zombie movies and TV shows and things like that we have today really sort of owe a huge debt to Romero and to Night of the Living Dead. There's a couple of interesting things about Night of the Living Dead that I think are really worth considering. One is just the figure of the zombie as such in the film. Because, I mean, these are your old school zombies. These are fairly slow moving, not particularly bright. They're not necessarily, as individual zombies, they're not that difficult to defeat. But one of the things that is really unsettling about them is what Sigmund Freud would call the uncanny. So, and this is actually generally true about zombies, but as you get sort of later, as you get more recent with a lot of zombie movies and TV shows and things like this, it increasingly becomes gore as such. And there's some gore in Night of the Living Dead, but it's not initially driven by gore. It's initially driven by the uncanny. And what Freud means by the uncanny is basically this idea that a thing is familiar, but not quite right. There's something, some twist about it that's deeply unsettling, that says this is not the thing you're familiar with. And that's the zombie. The zombie, in a way, is the perfect example of the uncanny, because it's a human being that's not a human being. It's a physical human body being motored by the central nervous system, the brain and the central nervous system, but it's no longer a person. It lacks, in Hebrew, I think the term would be neshama, the spark of humanity. The zombie is humanity reduced to a biological machine. Its only objective is to seek out victims and consume them. Which in a way is... So this is not dissimilar to what human beings actually are. Like, we are physical machines, but we're also more than physical machines. We have ideas, we have emotions, we have thoughts, we have lovely YouTube channels and things like this. For zombies, none of those things really exist. They are simply eating machines, but they look like us. And we see this actually pretty clearly in the opening scene of the film, where Barbara and Johnny are at the cemetery. Sorry. Barbara and Johnny are at the cemetery, placing a wreath on their father's grave, and they see the first zombie of the film. And he's not gory, he's not decaying, he's walking slightly oddly, but not necessarily enough that it arouses any suspicion. And because Johnny's sort of messing around and like making fun of Barbara for being afraid in the graveyard, she actually goes over to this zombie to apologize because she thinks he's a living human being. And when he attacks her, that's when the uncanny really kicks in. I mean, you actually get the sense of the uncanny just seeing this guy sort of lurch around in the background, because he's clearly human, he's clearly a person, but there's something that's not quite right. And then when he attacks Barbara, this sense of the uncanny really comes to the forefront. And so that's... Yes, later on there are some gory scenes of vampires, of zombies eating their victims, etc., etc. But it's really, for the most part, it's the uncanny nature of the zombie that drives the horror in Night of the Living Dead. It's about this sort of fear of the thing that's no longer quite human. And that, I mean, it's a fantastic... Night of the Living Dead is a fantastic example of how to build that type of horror, that very classic approach to horror, that starts really in the noir period of the 20s and 30s and goes up into the 60s. So that's one thing that's really striking, is it's a fantastic example of this classic technique for building horror, without relying on a lot of special effects and gore and things like this necessarily. The other thing that's striking to me is, and this is a sort of minor thing in the movie maybe, but because of the political moment that we happen to be in April 2021, it's really striking to me how the movie ends, which is that Ben, who's he's the leader of this small group of people who are holed up in this house, although his leadership is contested somewhat, but he's basically the leader of this group. Ben is the only one who survives the zombie attempt to overrun them. Everyone else is killed in one way or another. But Ben survives and manages to lock himself in the basement and just sort of wait till morning, when police and a bunch of random people with guns come and shoot all the zombies in the head and light them on fire. But the thing that's really striking at the end, Ben comes out of the basement, moves toward the front of the house, and from outside of the house, the sheriff has one of his men shoot Ben in the head. Now, what's striking about that, especially, is that Ben is African American. And we have seen of late a number of instances in which African Americans have been killed by police, including African Americans who have called the police for help. So, rewatching this movie, or watching it for the first time for those who haven't seen it, in 2021, the ending is very striking, that the African American man who has been waiting for help to arrive is in fact killed by those who have ostensibly come to help him.